Chapter 36 of the last Chronicle of Barset. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Clifford. The Last Chronicle of Barset by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 36. Grace Crawley returns home. About this time Grace Crawley received two letters, the first of them reaching her while John Eames was still at the cottage, and the other immediately after his return to London. They both help to tell our story, and our reader shall therefore read them if he so pleases, or rather he shall read the first and as much of the second as is necessary for him. Grace's answer to the first letter he shall see also. Her answer to the second will be told in a very few words. The first was from Major Grantly, and the task of answering that was by no means easy to Grace. Cosby Lodge, February, 186 . Dearest Grace, I told you when I parted from you that I should write to you, and I think it best to do so at once in order that you may fully understand me. Spoken words are soon forgotten. I shall never forget his words, Grace said to herself as she read this. And are not always as plain as they might be. Dear Grace, I suppose I ought not to say so, but I fancied when I parted from you at Allington that I had succeeded in making myself dear to you. I believe you to be so true in spirit that you are unable to conceal from me the fact that you love me. I shall believe that this is so till I am deliberately and solemnly assured by yourself that it is not so, and I conjure you to think what is due both to yourself and to myself before you allow yourself to think of making such an assurance, unless it be strictly true. I have already told my own friends that I have asked you to be my wife. I tell you this in order that you may know how little effect your answer to me has had towards inducing me to give you up. What you said about your father and your family has no weight with me, and ought ultimately to have none with you. This business of your father's is a great misfortune, so great that probably, had we not known each other before it happened, it might have prevented our becoming intimate when we chanced to meet. But we had met before it happened, and before it happened I had determined to ask you to be my wife. What should I have to think of myself if I allowed my heart to be altered by such a cause as that? I have only further to say that I love you better than any one in the world, and that it is my best hope that you will be my wife. I will not press you till this affair of your father's has been settled, but when that is over I shall look for my reward without reference to its result. Not that I doubt the result if there be anything like justice in England, but that your debt to me, if you owe me any debt, will be altogether irrespective of that. If, as I suppose, you will remain at Allington for some time longer, I shall not see you till after the trial is over. As soon as that is done, I will come to you wherever you are. In the meantime I shall look for an answer to this. And if it be true that you love me, dear, dear Grace, pray have the courage to tell me so. Most affectionately your own, Henry Grantly. When the letter was given to Grace across the breakfast table, both Mrs. Dale and Lily suspected that it came from Major Grantly, but not a word was spoken about it. When Grace, with hesitating hand, broke the envelope, neither of her friends looked at her. Lily had a letter of her own, and Mrs. Dale opened the newspaper. But still it was impossible not to perceive that her face became red with blushes, and then they knew that the letter must be from Major Grantly. Grace herself could not read it, though her eye ran down over the 2 pages, catching a word here and a word there. She had looked at the name at once, and had seen the manner of his signature, "Most affectionately your own." What was she to say to him? Twice, thrice, as she sat at the breakfast table, she turned the page of the letter, and at each turning she read the signature. And she read the beginning, "Dearest Grace." More than that she did not really read till she had got the letter away with her into the seclusion of her own room. Not a word was said about the letter at breakfast. Poor Grace went on eating, or pretending to eat, but could not bring herself to utter a word. Mrs. Dale and Lily spoke of various matters which were quite indifferent to them, But even with them the conversation was so difficult that Grace felt it to be forced, and was conscious that they were thinking about her and her lover. As soon as she could make an excuse she left the room, and hurrying upstairs took the letter from her pocket and read it in earnest. "That was from Major Grantly, mamma," said Lily. "I dare say it was, my dear." "And what had we better do, or what had we better say?" "Nothing, I should say. Let him fight his own battle. If we interfere we may probably only make her more stubborn in clinging to her old idea." "I think she will cling to it." "For a time she will, I dare say. And it will be best that she should. He himself will respect her for it afterwards." Thus it was agreed between them that they should say nothing to Grace about the letter unless Grace should first speak to them. Grace read her letter over and over again. It was the first love letter she had ever had, the first letter she had ever received from any man except her father and brother, the first almost that had ever been written to her by any other than her own old special friends. The words of it were very strange to her ear. He had told her when he left her that he would write to her, and therefore she had looked forward to the event which had now come, but she had thought that it would be much more distant, and she had tried to make herself believe that when it did come it would be very different from this letter which she now possessed. "He will tell me that he has altered his mind. He ought to do so. It is not proper that he should still think of me when we are in such disgrace." But now the letter had come, and she acknowledged the truth of his saying that written words were clearer in their expression than those simply spoken. "Not that I could ever forget a syllable that he said." Yet as she held the letter in her hand she felt that it was a possession. It was a thing at which she could look in coming years when he and she might be far apart, a thing at which she could look with pride in remembering that he had thought her worthy of it. Neither on that day nor on the next did she think of her answer, nor on the third or the fourth with any steady thinking. She knew that an answer would have to be written, and she felt that the sooner it was written, the easier might be the writing. But she felt also that it should not be written too quickly. A week should first elapse, she thought, and therefore a week was allowed to elapse, and then the day for writing her answer came. She had spoken no word about it either to Mrs. Dale or to Lily. She had longed to do so, but had feared. Even though she should speak to Lily, she could not be led by Lily's advice. Her letter, whatever it might be, must be her own letter. She would admit of no dictation. She must say her own say, let her say it ever so badly. As to the manner of saying it, Lily's aid would have been invaluable, but she feared that she could not secure that aid without compromising her own power of action, her own individuality, and therefore she said no word about the letter either to Lily or to Lily's mother. On a certain morning she fixed herself at her desk to write her letter. She had known that the task would be difficult, but she had little known how difficult it would be. On that day of her first attempt she did not get it written at all. How was she to begin? He had called her dearest Grace, and this mode of beginning seemed as easy as it was sweet. "It is very easy for a gentleman," she said to herself, "because he may say just what he pleases." She wrote the words "Dearest Henry" on a scrap of paper, and immediately tore it into fragments as though she were ashamed of having written them. She knew that she would not dare to send away a letter beginning with such words. She would not even have dared to let such words in her own handwriting remain within the recesses of her own little desk. "Dear Major Grantly," she began at length. It seemed to her to be very ugly, but after much consideration she believed it to be correct. On the second day the letter was written as follows: Allington, Thursday. My dear Major Grantly, I do not know how I ought to answer your kind letter, but I must tell you that I am very much flattered by your great goodness to me. I cannot understand why you should think so much of me, but I suppose it is because you have felt for all our misfortunes. I will not say anything about what might have happened if it had not been for papa's sorrow and disgrace. and as far as I can help it, I will not think of it. But I am sure that I ought not to think about loving any one, that is, in the way you mean, while we are in such trouble at home. I should not dare to meet any of your great friends, knowing that I had brought nothing with me but disgrace. And I should feel that I was doing an injury to dear Edith, which would be worse to me than anything. Pray believe that I am quite in earnest about this. I know that a gentleman ought not to marry any girl to do himself and his family an injury by it. And I know that if I were to make such a marriage, I should be unhappy ever afterwards, even though I loved the man ever so dearly, with all my heart. These last words she had underscored at first, but the doing so had been the unconscious expression of her own affection, and had been done with no desire on her part to convey that expression to him. But on reading the words she discovered their latent meaning, and wrote it all again. Therefore I know that it will be best that I should wish you good bye, and I do so, thanking you again and again for your goodness to me. Believe me to be yours very sincerely, Grace Crawley. The letter, when it was written, was hateful to her, but she had tried her hand at it again and again, and had found that she could do nothing better. There was much in his letter that she had not attempted to answer. He had implored her to tell him whether or no she did in truth love him. Of course she loved him. He knew that well enough. Why should she answer any such question? There was a way of answering it indeed which might serve her turn, or rather serve his, of which she was thinking more than of her own. She might say that she did not love him. It would be a lie, and he would know that it would be a lie. But still it might serve the turn. She did not like the idea of writing such a lie as that, but nevertheless she considered the matter. It would be very wicked, but still, if it would serve the turn, might it not be well to write it? But at last she reflected that after all, the doing of the thing was in her own hands. She could refuse to marry this man without burdening her conscience with any lie about it. It only required that she should be firm. She abstained therefore from the falsehood, and left her lover's question unanswered. So she put up her letter and directed it, and carried it herself to the village post office. On the day after this she got the second letter, and that she showed immediately to Mrs. Dale. It was from her mother, and was written to tell her that her father was seriously ill. "He went up to London to see a lawyer about this weary work of the trial," said Mrs. Crawley. "The fatigue was very great, and on the next day he was so weak that he could not leave his bed. Dr. Turner, who has been very kind, says that we need not frighten ourselves, but he thinks it must be some time before he can leave the house. He has a low fever on him, and wants nourishment. His mind has wandered once or twice, and he has asked for you, and I think it will be best, love, that you should come home. I know you will not mind it when I say that I think he would like to have you here. Dr. Turner says that the illness is chiefly owing to his not having proper food." Of course she would go at once. "Dear Mrs. Dale," she said, "I must go home. Can you send me to the station?" Then Mrs. Dale read the letter. Of course they would send her. Would she go on that day or the next? Might it not be better to write first and say that she was going? But Grace would go at once. "I know it will be a comfort to mamma, and I know that he is worse than mamma says." Of course there was no more to be said, and she was dispatched to the station. Before she went, Mrs. Dale asked after her purse. "If there is any trouble about money, for your journey or anything, you will not scruple to come to me as to an old friend." But Grace assured her that there was no trouble about money for her journey. Then Lily took her aside and produced 2 clean new £5 notes. "Grace, dear, you won't be ill-natured. You know I have a little fortune of my own. You know I can give them without missing them." Grace threw herself into her friend's arms and wept, but would have none of her money. "Buy a present from me for your mother, whom I love though I do not know her." "I will give her your love," Grace said, "but nothing else." And then she went. Chapter 36